We're recording. Oh, we are live. I was watching for it. I was waiting for it. Oh, the camera's right there. Look at that. The camera's right where the live button is, so I can almost tap the live. What's up, wrestling fans? Once again, I'm amazed that we are live. Technology and Canadian destroyers just kind of destroy my brain sometimes.
Doug, I'm happy you found your camera. You just keep looking at it for the next hour. We are going to be talking into those cameras, talking to the people at home on a Thursday night. You know what that means.
It's the night between Dynamite and SmackDown.
It is also the rare occasion where we're not on Sunday night because we don't feel like competing with Tony Khan and AEW Revolution. If you missed, folks, our AEW Revolution preview, it's in the archives. Check it out. The show from Sunday. We got you covered match by match, winners and losers. But we have a special topic tonight, Doug, a singular topic that is on everyone's minds in the wrestling world. We're doing a deep dive tonight. Wrestling for sale.
This is a deep dive. We're throwing the normal format out the window tonight, going straight into a topic. And, on Sunday, you pointed out something that I really had not thought about because as a wrestling fan, I don't necessarily think of wrestling like I do sports ball and all those other things. But I guess it's a very good point you bring up that, the WWE is a major sports franchise, even though they're sports entertainment. So that does kind of change the complexion of my argument that they're not going to be worth what, Vince McMahon is asking. Maybe they actually are, Kevin.
$9 billion is what he's asking. Fans, if you missed the show on Sunday, we were talking about the $9 billion reportedly that Vince wants. Will he get $9 billion? We have some sports franchises coming pretty darn close, 6.5, 7. If he can say and prove that, we produce weekly television year-round content that is completely cord-cutting proof that people will subscribe and you can sell those ads again. Who knows, Doug? It could happen, or at least get close. That could be the man's opening offer, or it could just be a ruse to get himself back in the driver's seat. And he doesn't
exactly.
plan on selling
Let's
right?
go like ridiculously high, so nobody will go for it except the Saudis. Because I still think, and I still have this great fear that Saudi is going to take our beloved WWE that Triple H has gently, ushered into this amazing new creative era, and just use it as a propaganda machine for the next 6-7 years, and then just totally discard it because it won't their initiative to make Saudi great again or whatever they're doing will be over at that point, and it'll just be thrown by the wayside, and Tony Khan can come and pick it up for like $1.25 or something.
I mean, will it happen? Won't it happen? Who will it go to? What will they get for it? These are questions that we will obviously not know the answer to until it actually occurs. Here on the Two Bros Wrestling Show, we're going to keep tabs on all of that. Doug, tonight we're looking to see the history of such things and what it may point to for WWE. Obviously, they're pretty openly for sale right now. It's the cover that Vince used to get back in the driver's seat of the company. No sale is likely to happen until at least after WrestleMania. And with it being a matter of more when and to whom and for how much than just if, we thought this would be a good time to look at the history of wrestling companies and major transactions and how it ended up for all of those involved. Doug, we're going to primarily focus on the Vince McMahon era, just because that is the modern wrestling era that most of our viewers might be familiar with. But before we talk about the modern era of wrestling, we have to go back to the beginning and how wrestling became sports ball, as you say, into sports entertainment.
Right. Because wrestling was a legit sport.
And thousands of people would show up to watch it. It was a popular spectator sport.
Absolutely.
However, when you have dwindling attention spans and lots of competition, which is, of course, is our modern situation, you have to do something to get those eyeballs. And crowds started to dwindle because matches, they would last sometimes 4 or 5 hours. And these were legit sports contests. So You think fans get restless now with the boring chants, Doug? You want to go watch a 3 hour headlock? Yeah, I mean, that's what it was starting to be.
3 hour headlock. Isn't that an AEW pay-per-view that's coming up soon? 3 hour headlock.
Something had to change for sure. And this is how wrestling went from being wrestling to what we think of as professional wrestling as a show
Right.
today. And because it should be noted that as a sport, it was much like boxing. You'd have a promoter. He'd come. He'd rent a building.
Mhm.
He would purchase some, rent some wrestlers for the evening, put on some matches, and that was it. The idea of a company or a promotion, that is really our modern way of thinking
Mhm.
of wrestling. And that began to change in around the 1920s. So I had not heard of this till I did my research, Doug. Maybe you have heard of a collective known as the Gold Dust Trio.
No, because really, my research talks more about the transformation that happened during the NWA in the 40s, but I think you went a little bit deeper there with the Gold Dust Trio, and we're not talking about the Gold Dust, right?
As soon as I saw this name, Doug, first thing I thought is like, I'm wondering if that's like an insider joke and
Right.
where they came up with it. I had never heard of the Gold Dust Trio, but apparently were a group of men who turned wrestling into a business, a big time
Interesting.
business. They concentrated on the performance element of wrestling. They shortened those 5 hour matches.
Right.
They jazzed everything up with razzle dazzle. They began scripting winners and losers, good guys, bad guys. Guess what? It's sports entertainment. That's what
Right.
they basically
Yeah.
came up with. They just didn't call it that. And that's turned it into a business. Probably where you pick up then too in your research, because
Oh,
that would lead you right into the National Wrestling Alliance and the
yeah.
NWA, because before that
Mhm.
you had all these like promoters that were loosely aligned, and then you had 12 guys who hated each other come together in a room in Iowa and decide, we could probably make more money if we put our differences aside, recognize one world champion, and work together. And that became the NWA.
NWA. Isn't it, like throughout history, you have these like, these clandestine groups coming together for the betterment of themselves. And even in wrestling, we have
Yeah.
that.
Well, you often hear that those early days and the territory days, which is where we're getting
Oh,
into
yeah.
at this point, is that it was like the mafia, right? That these were, but I read a quote that was, some wrestlers at the time saying, but the mafia was more honest. So, I mean, these were not, in fact, that takes, really the NWA takes me into the TV era. And when you really start to see the buying and selling, because the
Right.
NWA, because they were ran like a mafia group, you were either with us, you're either with the
Hmm.
family or you are against the family. So they began to
And,
blackball guys. If you weren't on the
mhm.
ends, you didn't wrestle. If you were a rival promoter and you didn't want to join the NWA for, whatever price it was to join the
Right.
family, right? You were blackballed. You couldn't get your arenas
Hmm.
or whatever. The federal government got involved. They actually were taken before the U.S. government investigated them for
Unregulated.
antitrust
Uh-huh.
and being a monopoly, the National Wrestling Alliance.
Well, I can see that because the NWA, I mean, it took all these, I'm looking at my notes here. Uh, I mean, all of these promoters came together to create a governing body,
The governing body, yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's the family. It is the mafia,
Yeah.
and they got taken to task for illegal monopoly, blocking competition. Investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice resulted in the NWA signing the consent decree of 1956, which basically let them off the hook, but made them have to ditch all their bylaws and have new bylaws and anti-competitive measures to make sure that competition was allowed. Because the government was intervening, a lot of promoters looked at that as their opportunity to break away, and that's what you started to
Exactly.
see. the breakaways.
Exactly. And then you start to see the NWA fragment and fragment and fragment to where there was once this almost, WWE, like, like those dark times in wrestling where in America we had basically the WWE and that was it. We had our smaller, quiet, Impact, TNA, ROH, but, NWA was the thing back in the day. And then they start to
Yeah.
break up and splinter from that.
So it would have been around like that time, the decree of 56, early 60s, you get your first major breakaway. Vern Gagne forms the American Wrestling Association.
Right.
Shortly thereafter, here's a familiar name, Vince McMahon. Ever heard of him?
We're talking senior now, correct?
Vince Sr. starts the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and then you went from one monopoly of local promotions to 3 major promotions that almost everyone in the United States affiliated with one of those 3.
Right.
So that means, Doug, that's the territory era. And I know you and I both have kind of a fondness in our heart for the territory era just because that's what we grew up on.
Absolutely. Jim Crockett Promotion, come on, man.
What you get is really 20 or so years of promotions in the territory era, TV stations where you have your local promotions come into the TV studio after the newscast, the weather guys, now your announcer or something. I mean, these were real mom and pop kind of regional. Everyone had their local champions, and then there were traveling world champions. But these territories were very often bought, sold, combined. But that takes us up to where we really jump off on this topic, Doug, the modern era, the Vince McMahon era, as it were, because all that really changed, that territory system that you and I have such a fondness for.
Yeah.
1982, Vince McMahon Jr. this time.
Yep.
He buys the WWF from his dad. Doug, talk to the folks about the effects of this. How did this change wrestling as we still know it?
So we've talked about this before because Vince, when he bought the promotion from his father, he immediately set out to start breaking every unspoken rule there was, where you didn't go after some other guy's champion. Vince did that and went after the Randy Macho Man Savage, the Hulk Hogan, the Stick. He went after all of the big stars in all of the territories and started just gobbling up the territories and taking their biggest stars. Your Dusty Rhodes, your Ric Flairs. He was going after all those people to bring them into the WWF at that point, which was formerly the so many W's here, the WWF. Yes, the word, yeah. So, and that's where Vince kind of started breaking the rules by breaking those unspoken rules that had been, in place for generations at that point. You don't go after this guy's champion, you don't go after that guy's champion. Vince didn't care where those lines were. There were no lines. He was just bringing in the talent, all the talent he could find, and the top talent from every other promotion.
And 1982 is an important time to hone in on, because what happens in the 80s is that instead of local broadcast television, cable TV becomes a thing. And Vince saw that, we can be national. There's no more of that weatherman as your ring announcer and you're filming at the local studios. There could be just one promotion that everybody watches, and it should be mine. Now it should be noted he wasn't the first to have this idea. I mean, WTBS was already a cable at the very nascent formation of cable. It was one of the first national cable channels, and it had wrestling on it, and it was NWA wrestling, which again, our soft spots, because that's where you and I both fell in love with the sport, right?
Superstation, WTBS, out of Atlanta.
Vince definitely saw this and thought even larger. Before we get into some of what Vince did too, though, I don't know what you think, but for me, that purchase of Vince McMahon Jr. buying the business from Vince McMahon Sr., while maybe not the most money exchanged, so therefore it's probably not going to be the maybe the biggest deal we talk about tonight. But by far, I think that it is the purchase that changed the industry and led to everything else we're going to be talking about for the remainder of the show.
Oh, absolutely, because I think Vince set the precedent for everything that we know as modern wrestling. I know we talked about, uh, Jerry Jarrett, ushering in like more in-depth and dramatic storylines over professional wrestling, the in-ring wrestling like last week, when we touched on his passing. But, Vince basically set the stage for that by basically making wrestling what we know today.
Love him or hate him, it's true.
Yeah,
It's just
it
it
really
is
is.
the truth. So yeah, there isn't any of these other transactions wouldn't be happening had Vince not made that first one from getting the keys to the kingdom from his dad, and then of
Hmm.
course way eclipsing any vision that his father may have ever had. Which leads
I'm
us,
sure.
Doug,
Yeah.
to the first one I really want to talk about, because to me, this is the very first time that the wrestling business side of things, not the wrestling entertainment side,
Right.
but the business side would affect a small child from Switzer, West Virginia, who was sitting at home on a Saturday, as he loved to do, to watch his Georgia Championship Wrestling. When
Mhm.
on July 14th, 1984, uh, Black Saturday, as it came to be known. Doug, were you? That's what they call it.
I do. I do not. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. I want to hear this.
Were you watching in '84? I know we're close in age,
I'm.
but as a kid, a year or two can make a big difference, especially when not everyone had cable at the time. So I don't know if you were tuning in
I,
'84.
I, I'm sure I was watching. I don't particularly remember a Black Saturday though.
Oh yeah. So what happened is July 14th, 1984, Kevin turns on the TV to see Georgia Championship Wrestling. Instead, he sees some announcers he's not familiar with. As it turns out, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, who owned Georgia Championship Wrestling, sold Georgia Championship Wrestling to Vince McMahon. And Vince immediately changed the programming and switched Georgia Championship Wrestling from the NWA, merged it into the WWF, and took over the time slot. So suddenly there were wrestlers that I was not as familiar with, or guys that I knew vaguely from the wrestling magazines that I didn't like. And everybody that I had watched, Ric Flair, all these, they were just gone. And I remember being so upset because Georgia Championship Wrestling at that point had been on TBS for 12 years. And suddenly you just tune in one day and Vince had taken over. And he did a couple weeks worth of like the studio shows that we had all just with WWE talent, and then realized that that was maybe too costly. So they stopped doing a studio show. They just started doing tapes of house shows. They just started showing
Oh.
tapes from the studio, and no one. It was awful. And you mentioned it earlier. I mean, this is how Vince began. He began poaching
Right.
everyone's talent or buying promotions wholesale. If he could do neither of those things, what he would do is this: he would either buy your television time right out from underneath you. And he tried to do that. And this is one of the few failures in Vince McMahon's takeover of the wrestling territories, because Georgia Championship Wrestling was so loved that ratings absolutely tanked. And I mean, tanked to the point that Vince was forced to retreat and sell to the back to the NWA. The NWA president at the time, Doug, Mr. Jim Crockett
Jim
Jr.,
Crockett.
owner of Jim Crockett Promotions. This might
Yes.
be about where you come in
Yeah.
to your fandom, because that's probably what you think of as. I don't know. Do you remember Georgia Championship Wrestling, or do you remember?
I remember NWA Jim Crockett Promotions. Because and it looks
So
like that
yeah,
happened around in '84 too. Because Crockett bought the Universal Wrestling Federation from Bill Watts around that time.
but that's the next one we want to talk about,
Uh-huh.
because Jim Crockett Promotions buys World Championship Wrestling, which is what it was now called, from Vince McMahon Jr. for $1 million, and returned NWA programming to TBS. So what would you make of that transaction? Might be slightly before you were getting into the product, or before you had TBS up at Lake. But I mean, $1 million for what WCW was to become, I'm thinking that's a pretty decent outcome.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's, are we talking like in 80, what is that, 82, 84? We're talking right now? So
Yeah.
that's big money in 84.
Yeah.
I'm not going to adjust for inflation right now because I can barely remember what I had for breakfast this morning, but I'm sure that's I'm sure it's not 9 billion though. Let me say that.
Well, yeah, exactly. $1 million, even adjusted, big money at the time. Probably, if you look about it, this is the era of the territories becoming many into a few. And so for $1 million, Jim Crockett went from being one of many NWA promotions to being the NWA promotion and the only real competition that Vince McMahon had standing in his
Right.
way. So for
Yeah.
that alone, I'd say that that was a pretty good deal for Jim Crockett.
Sure. Absolutely. And to become the legendary Jim Crockett off of $1 million like that.
This is where it does get tricky though, because for Jim Crockett promotions, this is where I call it like in the middle. Like, yes, someone needed to hold that line against Vince and his takeover. Jim Crockett became that man, but I call it in the middle only because he was only able to hold Vince off for so long.
Right. And Crockett didn't have a lot of financial success. I don't think he was taking in the money that Vince was taking in at that point because, some of these other promotions that Crockett, absorbed into the NWA around that time were not, financially viable, in the long run. So,
to wit, Vince may have failed in Georgia, but he pretty much succeeded everywhere else that he tried.
right.
Which
Yeah,
means by the
absolutely.
time Jim Crockett has himself a piece of the pie, Vince has everything else.
Yeah.
And that includes a lot of the big names, the big talent, the big contracts, the big TV deals. So it did become harder for Jim Crockett Promotions to generate the same kind of revenue that Vince was. And this gets us to, though, Jim Crockett trying to compete with Vince because he attempts to expand. A few guys held out against Vince. One of those guys was the legendary Cowboy Bill Watts. He tried to rebrand a territory into something that didn't sound so regional. Right. So he took Mid-South, which was we're talking the Rock and Roll Express, Midnight Express, Junkyard Dog, like big names. He tried to rebrand it the UWF, the Universal Wrestling Federation.
Yeah.
Did not go so well, Doug.
No, it did not. No. And that's what you start to see, throughout what we're going to be talking about, like these territories, federations, whatever you want to call them, these companies coming and going, being bought and sold, absorbed, reabsorbed. There's a lot of that throughout the history of wrestling that I'm not sure that everybody realizes because, a lot of our fans probably think, a lot of folks who view the show are like, it started and ended with, the Attitude Era and the Monday Night Wars. And there's a deep and rich history before that of loss and sorrow, really. I mean, so many promoters came up through trying to do something and trying to fight the good fight against Vince, kind of like Tony Khan is doing now, and like Dixie Carter's done in the past, and many before her, Jerry Jarrett, Jeff Jarrett.
Good old JR himself will say that Bill Watts was the man who mentored him in the business and taught him everything he needed to know. Bill Watts was considered a very smart businessman, but eventually he knew as he tried to expand nationally that it wasn't going to work, that he couldn't compete with Vince and his dollars. So when it proved difficult to expand the UWF, he began working in a partnership really with Vince's main competition, Crockett. So, hey, let's join together and let's take on the big, 1,000-pound gorilla as a team. He eventually, though, realized that that wasn't going to work. This is where Bill was a better businessman. As you said, Crockett wasn't exactly making a lot of money.
Right.
Somehow, Bill Watts was able to convince Jim Crockett that Vince McMahon was interested in buying the UWF. And that's all it took to get Jim Crockett to pull out the checkbook.
Sometimes with these promoters, man, it's who gets the one up. Especially back in the day. Wait, McMahon's all right. Yeah, well, here's more. Here's a bigger bag of cash for you. What's he got to that?
JR's got some great stories about that transaction and how Bill really felt so slighted by the working relationship with Jim Crockett that he didn't at all feel bad about basically cheating and fooling
Right.
Crockett into buying the promotion by faking the fact that Vince was interested. Not that Vince wouldn't have been interested. He was trying to
Sure.
gobble up everybody. It was a believable
Yeah.
story. Crockett thought he had himself a deal because it wasn't, he did get some UWF talent when he bought the UWF, but really what Crockett thought he was buying was all the TV deals that the
Right.
UWF had in place. What he didn't really realize was how many of those deals was Bill Watts paying to syndicate their television.
Uh-huh.
Crockett had to take that debt on and absorb that in the deal. And so what you end up with is a bunch of worthless television contracts. And then a lot of the wrestlers that weren't under contract left and went to WWF. What did Jim Crockett end up buying, right?
Terrible, man. What did Crockett end up buying there? I mean, really, I mean, where's the due diligence in researching what you're buying there, man?
He did get some talent that helped infuse and keep Jim Crockett Promotions going maybe longer than it would. And when you look at the list, these aren't nobodies. And he got Terry Taylor, Eddie Gilbert, he got the Freebirds, Dr. Death, Steve Williams, Rick Steiner, which would be big money through the WCW years, a young Sting, which is
Right.
probably a pretty good deal in itself. And honestly, I think the prize in the whole deal, he got that young announcer named Jim Ross.
Oh, yeah.
So, I think if you look at this deal, I don't know what you think, if this was good or bad. Obviously, it was bad for the UWF as a separate promotion. Maybe not great for Crockett as being a bad businessman, but it probably did infuse with enough talent to keep him going a little while longer in what was probably looking like a losing fight at the time.
Yeah, but I mean, really, we're looking at it through a historical lens, though, because we've got Sting, Terry Taylor, JR,
Freebird,
uh,
Steiner.
yeah, Freebird Steiner, these all like top dollar names, solid top shelf players that go on to create great wrestling histories for themselves. Oops. But
I mean, you're right, though. If they hadn't been bought by Jim Crockett, where would those guys have created that history?
right.
I mean, there would have been one place to go.
Exactly, and most of, let's be honest, all those guys except for Sting, I think, ended up there anyway, right?
Eventually, yeah.
And Sting even had his WrestleMania moment, so even Sting, made it to the WWE, WWF, WWF eventually.
So before I leave the topic, Doug, of Crockett and UWF, I'd like to point something out that's going to be a repeat. We will hear this again as we talk later on. But Jim Crockett thought there was great promise in taking UWF stars and keeping it as a separate promotion running with inside of his promotion, keep the brand names, and that way you could have UWF versus NWA. And Crockett fell to the same demon on your shoulder, I guess, that a lot of promoters fell victim to, and that is having these interpromotional feuds where you made sure that your guys went over their guys, even though they're all your guys at this point. So eventually all the UWF guys looked like chums because they always lost to the NWA guys. And so in that regard, you took your own talent and devalued them.
You devalue one of your own brands, and yeah, we will see this history repeated. It's almost like a wrestling curse, really. As we continue talking about this, it starts here. Probably before this, that if we go back and dig deep enough, there's probably this recurring theme where things like this happen. But on our radar, it starts with this, and like you say, this is going to come up again and again. We're going to see it with WCW, we're going to see it with AEW, ROH, but I'm getting ahead of us where we are.
No, it's actually a great time to move to the next topic, because I mean, as far as judging that deal, Doug, I say in the middle, because yes, it kept some big names in the NWA with Jim Crockett, but it also brought debt, the beginning of the end. It was less than a year after the UWF purchase that Jim Crockett himself had to sell. He was not able to even hold on to that for a year. So that's where we go next. On the verge of bankruptcy, Jim Crockett sold Jim Crockett Promotions to, I don't know, maybe you've heard of him, Ted Turner. Yeah, the name ring a bell.
And this goes back to that infamous Vince McMahon story where Vince is talking about Ted, calling him up and going, "Well, Vince, I'm in the wrestling business now," and he's like, "Well, I'm in the entertainment business." So
November 1988, Doug, is when this deal happened. Obviously, we all know the story of World Championship Wrestling, and let's not think about how it flames out at the end. That's many years down the road. Let's talk 1988. I have to say that other than Vince buying WWE from his dad and then later buying WCW, I think that Crockett selling to Turner would be the second best deal in wrestling history.
Absolutely. Because this did bring, first of all, it brought great wrestling for a while anyway to us all. But it was very, very profitable for Ted Turner. It was a good ROI for Turner for a while until it wasn't. Yeah. I mean, I guess any product, you can say that about any product. If you're getting a good ROI on it. But after that return investment starts to sour, then you start to look to start unloading it, which unfortunately, because of a bunch of bad deals, bad decisions, and I think that other than WWF, if you look at it, there's a solid business and an iron fist almost there where I think Ted Turner kind of removed himself from that. And then you had people running the promotion internally. And that's where WCW starts to die. But
that was a while. That's he had a run. Unlike Crockett, who was able to for a few years. Again, I know rose-colored glasses. You and I in 1988 would have been the prime age where we were seeing the NWA at its peak, which was about the time that the NWA switches over into being WCW. And I mean, WCW. And sorry, Tony Khan, to say this because I know you're trying and it's getting there. But as far as like anyone who ever beat Vince McMahon at the wrestling game, Ted Turner's the only one yet to have done that. Yeah. How can it be anything but a success that you go for, and for wrestling and wrestlers, you went from busting your butt in gyms to now you have two national promotions that outbid each other for your services, guaranteed contracts. I mean, wrestlers went from being guys who worked day jobs and wrestled on the weekends at your local TV studios to men having careers that was able to sustain their families after their retirement because of WCW and Vince McMahon. And I mean, the Monday Night War is the hottest time in the history of the business.
Absolutely. I mean, it ushered in, and we have folks like Nash and Hall, jumping ship to get those first guaranteed contracts to lay that foundation, which unfortunately also kind of led to the end of WCW when you start letting the big boys who play actually run the show too. But that's
it is still, to me, that is still kind of a golden age. That 80s into the 90s was the golden age of modern wrestling, at least, and when it became not just a business but big international business. That was as hot as any type of entertainment being produced at the time.
Absolutely. When Raw was drawing 6 and 7 million, and the same for Nitro on Monday nights, and I mean these are numbers Vince McMahon, Triple H, and Tony Khan would legit kill for right now.
Yeah.
Those were it was truly a golden age. Where are all those other 4.5, 5.5 million, not billion? It's a little bit too many people watching wrestling. Maybe it would be worth 9 billion if 5 billion people on the planet were watching it every Monday. But that wrestling fan base has dwindled significantly, in the past 20, 30 years.
Even as the value of the companies have gone up, the eyeballs on
Absolutely.
have gone down. It's not the
Yeah,
center, it's not the in the zeitgeist of pop culture the way that it once was.
absolutely not.
And you can thank Ted Turner for that, who was legitimately a wrestling fan. Again, TBS was Turner Broadcasting, and he had wrestling on his
mhm,
superstation all the way back into the early 70s. He had a long history, so he was probably the right guy to take Vince on at that time. But he wasn't the only guy to get back in the ring against Vince. There was a young, arrogant young promoter of Eastern Championship Wrestling who decided that he was going to revolutionize the business in his own way. Doug, this is another guy that I'm not sure you've heard of or not, but Paul E
what
is, I think, what he went by, Paul Heyman.
has he ever introduced himself to anyone? This doesn't sound familiar at all. I mean, this is the kind of guy that should walk out and introduce himself to people and get his name out there.
We won't go into the whole history of Extreme Championship Wrestling and how ECW revolutionized wrestling, but it did. They all took their cues. That whole attitude came out of the raunchy, the bloody, the just
Mhm.
pushing the envelope was what ECW did. What they didn't really
Absolutely.
do a lot of, Doug, was make money. I mean,
Yeah.
you're being an underground band is fun and you can fill that club, but you really would like to fill the arena and actually not sleep in the van that night. So
And that gets back to what you're talking about before, because at the WCW and WWF at that time level, you had people like Bret Hart, Jim the Anvil Neidhart making a living for their families, you
yeah,
know, and then you had like, Sandman, who was probably, going to bingo halls and then, going to his job at Kroger working in the deli the next day or whatever. I mean, I don't know what Sandman did, but I mean, I use him as an example because it makes me think of the wrestler. The movie with
Mickey Rourke.
thank you, Mickey Rourke. That he had, I mean, he was the Ric Flair of his age, but now he
Yeah.
works at a deli. And I think a lot of wrestlers, especially ECW wrestlers, were holding down those day jobs or doing what they could to get through until the next TV. And Paulie was struggling to make payroll too, but he had a loyal group of employees that believed in what he was doing. And if I remember correctly, didn't Vince just kind of throw him a little bit of cash unofficially to keep them afloat for a while, Kevin?
We didn't know it at the time. It was only years later that we discovered that Vince understood the importance of having a feeder system way before you thought of like
Right.
I mean, he'd killed the territories, so there was no one left to poach. We're
Hmm.
years and years before a NXT and a developmental system. So,
Yeah.
hey, no one's watching anyway, but you don't have TV, you don't have clearance, you have buzz, and you got a good wrestling
Hmm.
mind. Yeah, Vince McMahon was quietly subsidizing ECW, but Paul had his eyes on something bigger. We talk recurring themes like promoters trying to do interpromotional things where they make the mistake of
Hmm.
always making sure their guys go over. Here's another thing that's going to be recurring: TV is important. All right, so when Jim
Yeah.
Crockett thought he was getting UWF television and found out that there wasn't really any television he was acquiring, what did he really end up with? Paul knew the only way he was going to survive was to land that national TV deal. You were just not going to
Sure.
make it without television. And then the glory day arrived. National TV, a deal with ECW and TNN. This was all great at first.
Hmm.
ECW, in fact, was the highest rated show on TNN in August of 1999. Really, the first ECW I saw outside of like random tapes here and there. I was able to watch on a
Yes.
regular basis. I'm sure you were too in 99, watching ECW for the first time. It was amazing. Saw
It
ECW
was
live for the
amazing.
first time in its
Yes.
original incarnation. It was short lived because Vince McMahon decided he wanted to get Raw back on TNN.
Hmm.
And it didn't matter how good ECW was doing on TNN. ECW had always struggled financially. And when Vince decided he wanted back on TNN, but wouldn't go back if
Sure.
Paul Lee was still on the air, bye bye Paul. And that was really the final straw. They struggled for a little while longer, but they couldn't compete without television.
And again and again, you say what you will about Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon has made very strategic business moves throughout life, his business life, that position him in a place of power and a place of success. I mean, the man, you look at these deals, you look at what he's done, it's ruthless, which makes me think that, maybe he can get 9 billion out of it the more I think about it. It may come from Saudi Arabia, it may be oil money, but
You say he's ruthless. I mean, he is.
right. So I mean, just that, because what happens from that, he gets Raw back on TNN.
And he
He
buys ECW.
and exactly, and he buys ECW. He buys WCW.
So let's look at this ECW deal first, because it kind of sets the blueprint for what would come later. For Vince, I mean, let's evaluate this deal. It's bad for ECW. There goes really the land of extreme that revolutionized the industry. There goes Paul Heyman as a creative owner and force to being a either an advisor or a character on TV. He was never the mastermind running the show again.
Right. Right.
So yes, on that end it was bad. But from Vince, look what he did. For Vince, it's pocket change what he paid for ECW.
Which again, he was already subsidizing anyway. So
all the guys that he didn't care for, it was bad for them. But
yeah,
if you wanted to poach an RVD, a Dudley Boys, all that that he ended up taking, the real deal for Vince here though is not just those guys, but the steal was the video library. So many guys had come up quickly through ECW to WWE or WCW. Think about how to this day Vince has managed this many 20 some years on, how he's still monetizing that ECW library.
Absolutely.
That was the steal of the deal. That brand of ECW is owned lock, stock, and barrel by Vince McMahon to this day.
Yeah. Again, an incredibly shrewd businessman. Creatively, personally, think of him what you will, but you cannot deny his shrewd business acumen. I mean, my goodness, just look at what he has done and what he's done for wrestling, and then look at how he's done it, like this.
So like this is exactly what he did for his next move, which was basically take that ECW blueprint and turn it up to 20. So this takes us, obviously we're in 2001 when ECW is bought by Vince McMahon. WCW being purchased by the WWE. Let's look at how this goes down. It wasn't really shocking that WCW was sold or went under. The real shock came in who did the buying, and that Vince put himself in the position to be the buyer. You said it earlier, Doug. Ratings were good in WCW, and not just when they started having some financial. Yes, they had financial mismanagement. They had some bad contracts that were giving too many non-workers too much real huge dollar contracts. But in the grand scheme, the ratings were still high. If you had a buyer come in that had a decent wrestling mind, you could make a few small fixes, a few contract buyouts, and turn that around really, really quick. The ratings were high, and the product was still relatively cheap to produce, and got a lot of eyeballs on your programming. The problem became, because that's exactly what Eric Bischoff was counting on, that I can fix this. He got with some investors, he was going to buy it. What Eric Bischoff hadn't counted on is that the AOL Time Warner management group that had just bought Turner decided they didn't want to be in the wrestling business.
Yeah, we're no longer in the wrestling business.
So when you don't have television, here comes that repeated theme. Suddenly you went from a really valuable promotion that, despite all of the mismanagement and problems, could have been fixed because I still have a high-rated show on TNT, a high-rated show on TBS every single week. We can make money off this. Suddenly, what are you buying if you don't have TBS and TNT guarantee contracts?
You're buying the tape library, Kevin. You're buying the talent in the tape library, which is what Vince got out of WCW. Again.
Once you took away the television, what does the talent roster and the talent library mean to anyone else at that time other
Exactly.
than the only one who could
Exactly.
do anything with it?
Exactly. I mean, Vince was building the WWE network, ages ago, a decade before the WWE network went live. He was backloading and backfilling with ECW, WCW, all of the NWA promotions that had fed in and were part of WCW at that point. All those libraries, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. By the time there was no TV that you were buying, suddenly the Jarretts couldn't do anything with it. Bischoff and his investors, there was nothing they could do with that. Basically, it left one buyer who could do anything with it, and for pennies on the dollar, he took a worthless now WCW and bought, like you said, the talent and look at all the wrestlers that he got out of that deal, and
right.
then more importantly, that tape library.
Yeah, I mean, 'cause
But
at that point it becomes a Booker T, yes, please, Disco Inferno, hit the road, brother.
yeah,
Kind of a situation.
those are good. That was the right move on both of those
Yeah,
decisions.
yes.
$4.2 million, Doug, the final sale of WCW for all that they did to actually beat Vince McMahon at his own
Un-
game. He picks them
Unbelievable.
up for 4.2.
Uh,
2.7 for the trademarks and logo, and then the additional 1.7 for the library. He paid $1.7 million for that whole library.
Unbelievable.
Now, to date, obviously, a Saudi deal or a $9 billion deal or whatever will eclipse it. But to date, this has been the biggest and most impactful transaction in wrestling history. In my mind, I know it's certainly been in my lifetime the most
Hmm.
important deal, but I don't think that there's anything in history you can point to that was bigger than what this deal was. Because now
No.
you go back to that whole NWA thing of like, now we're a monopoly again.
Yeah. Yeah, you really. I mean, you have, your upstart, with the Jarretts and TNA back in the day, and NWA is scrapping along still, but Vince was reigning as the true god of wrestling.
And he bought his company. There were no more dragons to slay, and in some ways,
Really.
that was kind of the start of the creative end of Vince McMahon too. He didn't have that dragon to slay anymore, and you could
Hmm.
argue that he started to fall a little out of touch when he didn't have someone to compete against.
This is so true. I mean, he went with what he liked because it didn't really matter if he liked it. Surely somebody else out there was going to like it, and if they didn't, well, that was tough because this is the wrestling you get.
Where else are you going to go if you want it, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Let's
Where else are
let,
you going to go?
let's talk about a couple of those places that ended up being where else you're going to go because they're minor deals compared to the one we're just talked about. That is the biggest deal to date until the one that we'll be talking about here on the future show, I'm sure, when Vince does
Hmm.
sell. But people tried to step up and fill that void when WCW went out. Most notably would be the Jarretts created TNA, tried to revive the
Hmm.
NWA. It started really the National Wrestling Alliance, trying to that tie in NWA, TNA. They didn't hold it for very long till they sold it, to Dixie Carter. It was pretty shrewd, actually, of the
Hmm.
Jarretts realizing, like, we got something started, but we can't keep this running without a money person. Dixie
Hmm.
Carter and the Panda Energy Company in 2002 basically bankrolled that company for a
Yeah.
decade. I mean, from the time that Jarrett started, everyone predicted, give him a month, give him 2 months, this will
Right.
not last. They were doing weekly pay-per-views that you'd had to buy the show
Hmm.
every week. No one thought that would last, and here they are still kicking.
Yep. We have Impact Wrestling to this day because of what they built there. It's not that Dragon Slayer, that's going to come up against the juggernaut that is WWE, but they've carved out their own little niche. So
They did, and to her credit, I guess, whether it was just for fame or just love or whatever, Dixie Carter probably kept that promotion going way longer than it had
yeah,
any business to stay in business. That takes us
absolutely.
to the sale I want to talk about, Doug, because when the Carter family finally did sell, it was a quick
Hmm.
succession. Hot potato owners. They briefly sold it to Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins, but when the Fight Network became involved with the promotion, Corgan said it was a breach, and he ended up
I
in
remember
lawsuits,
that.
Corgan left. And
Yes.
so, yeah, again, everyone thought here finally comes the death of this promotion that should have died a long
Hmm.
time ago. And yet it didn't. Anthem Sports stepped in
Right.
and purchased TNA, now called Impact, and brought some
Hmm.
stability. It was back on Access, which was more of a larger cable network than TNA had struggled to find a
Yeah.
home on for the prior 5 or 6 years. And they've actually had some creative moments and periods in the company's history where the promotion's been kind of hot, and it gives men and women another place to work, even if the audience is smallish. I'm thinking that this has been a pretty good deal. I'm sure Anthem didn't pay a fortune for what
Right.
was TNA at the time, and they've kept it going. So I would say this has been good for the sport. It was the first
Yeah.
real post WCW promotion to really survive and continue to survive.
Yeah, yeah, I remember like early on in the TNA days, actually seeing with you TNA
Yeah,
when TNA was what like a Fox, some odd like off Fox Sports network,
yeah.
off brand Fox Sports back in and to see they're still alive. They've had their clearly had their struggles, but TNA to Impact to what they are today, they're still kicking.
You look back at the other promotions we've talked about, even from the UWF to Jim Crockett to more successful players like the ECW or whatever. Like TNA lasted a lot longer than any of those regimes did, and
Hmm.
you would never have put money on that. So they've done
Yeah.
something to carve out their niche in the world of wrestling. We're not done with that Billy Corgan fellow though. Let's talk about
No,
Corgan. He,
no, we're not. He had
he
other
he didn't
pumpkins to smash, did he not?
he did have some other
Sorry.
pumpkins to smash. No, that's good. Because he just wasn't done with the wrestling business. When the Impact thing didn't work out for him in 2017, he was determined to be in the business. He bought the NWA. It was a bit shocking, Doug, that I guess for a
Yeah.
lot of us to go, what, the NWA still exists? That didn't we watch that when we were kids?
Not only to go, wait, the NWA still exists, and wait, Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins, William Patrick Corgan just purchased the NWA. What is going on?
It's so easy to poke fun at all of that. And that's what I did, as most people did. Like, okay, that's going to work. And
Uh-huh.
to his credit, the NWA was not just a shell of itself. He basically bought a name. I don't
Hmm.
know how much he paid for it, Doug, but what do you think about what Corgan has done by buying the NWA name? I think that this deal to me is mostly thumbs up just because it
I,
put the NWA back in the conversation and they've done some nice things.
from a sheer nostalgia point, I have to give this where my cameras, two thumbs up because it's the NWA. That's it's the NWA, and I really do like what Corgan has done with the NWA. I mean, the NWA is the first. Billy Corgan's NWA is the first time I saw Eddie Kingston. You know,
Yeah. Ricky Starks, my
Ricky
first Ricky
Starks.
Starks, Thunder
Yeah.
Rosa. I mean, he's
Yes.
done in a short period of time.
Yes.
Willow Nightingale. I mean, there's been
Yes.
several. And then that old school feel. Because I mean,
Yes.
yes, he bought a name that everyone laughed at him for because they're like that you're buying nothing but a name that no longer has value. And he's actually turned it into something that, again, smallish audience, but's had some
Hmm.
influence, and he has some. The pandemic derailed a lot of wrestling companies. He survived that and has some plans that I wouldn't discount them finding a small piece of the pie that they can hold on to.
Absolutely. I think I think so. I think the NWA, is here to stay, whether it, goes on to some other like eccentric rock star later on down the line or whatever. We're NWA has some power. No pun intended there with their NWA Power
Yeah,
Show.
that's good.
But
That's good. And that really is turning something out of nothing because I should point out we say TV is important, and we talked about the value of these libraries that Vince was smart enough to snatch up.
mhm,
Due to the way that most of the NWA was organized as really just various companies that were loosely
right.
aligned, that had membership basically that they paid for, Corgan
Hmm.
didn't acquire a vast tape library. I mean, he has a
Right.
mishmash of things. He's personally went and bought like the St. Louis territories
Hmm.
archives and things like that. But honestly, the reason that he didn't get it is by the time he came into the picture, most of what was the NWA library was already owned by various other people, most
Right.
notably Vince McMahon and the
This man, yeah.
WWE. He already owned the NWA's history for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doug, that takes us to the last I want to talk about because it's the most recent and maybe too early to judge. I know we've been judging these on what they might mean for the future WWE sale and what we felt like these deals meant for those involved at the time. Ring of Honor was a very much like ECW for its time. It was a niche. It revolutionized the industry. A lot of folks changed the way that they presented wrestling based on what Ring of Honor was doing on a small scale. But by the time Ring of Honor became a TV product that most people could access, it was already past its prime period. And then by the time last year came around, it was really just it was a feeder organization for NXT and WWE, and others had filled that void of what Ring of Honor used to be as a place you'd learn to wrestle when there was no longer territories. Ring of Honor became the biggest of the territories that still existed that had any prestige.
Yeah, ROH, I think I've said this before, ROH was NXT before there was NXT because so many top stars of today got their start in Ring of Honor. And I think that's
Bryan Danielson, Seth
CM
Rollins,
Samoa
CM
Joe,
Punk.
CM Punk. Yeah. I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
Nigel McGuinness, the Briscoes, it's Christopher
Claudio
Daniels, Kazarian. Yeah, Claudia. I mean, on and on. Wheeler Yuta, even recent guys, like even young guys that you don't think of as being around for that prime era of Ring of Honor. Ring of Honor still was. They were that company that always lost their stars because they knew they couldn't afford to keep them, and yet somehow managed to always create new stars.
Exactly. And we've seen this since Tony Khan has purchased Ring of Honor. We saw it with Vince doing this back in the WCW. ECW purchase where everybody in the McMahon family had like a wrestling promotion of their own and went to war with each other, and of course WWF came out on top of that. Tony is not doing that, not yet anyway. We're not seeing a lot of like this interpromotional stuff, but I guess we kind of are too because we have Samoa Joe holding all the TV belts, and so I would hate it's not as obvious though where we have ROH versus AEW, and I hope we don't see that. I like seeing ROH on AEW TV, but I don't want to see ROH versus AEW like we've seen in the past with all these other interpromotionals when stuff starts getting absorbed like that.
And if Tony, who is a wrestling fan and historian, has learned anything from history, he would see the things we're talking about tonight and how it didn't work out when Jim Crockett thought it would be great to put the NWA guys against the UWF guys, but make sure the UWF guys never won. Or Vince and the invasion angle when you had this prime ECW versus WCW versus, and yet WWE guys just mopped the floor with everybody else. And it was ridiculous. That said, though, what do you think about the fact we talked about that primary mistake happening in a lot of these transactions? The other primary mistake we've pointed out to a lot is the fact that if you don't have TV, you don't have much. To date, Tony Khan doesn't have TV. So what you have is a company being ran within another company. Do you think that he's going to be able to sustain that? Do you think that's good to keep going that direction? I know now he has no choice. What do you think the future of this deal is?
So just going back to what Billy Corgan has done with NWA Power specifically, I know like AEW Dark is something I don't watch regularly or, at all being the AEW mark that I am. But, it's a very different time we live in now where there are a lot of cord cutters out there. There are a lot of people who go to YouTube, for their entertainment. And I think that it's a potential route for success. I don't think you still need that TV because YouTube ad revenue is not going to take you very far.
Which is why we got to get up in the morning, right?
Exactly. Unless you get some affiliate marketing going on, and oh gosh, what's that game that everybody is always shilling on on YouTube channels, the fight game or whatever it is. But unless you have deals like that, the one Ronda Rousey's in now.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. I can't think of it, but yeah.
so it looks like that WWE even has the corner on that since Rousey's in that game. But you know, at least it is a potential avenue to get eyes on the product and keep the product going. And you do have some TV where you can again seed things with everybody from your non-televised promotion. You get them on TV.
I don't know that we ever
But
learned how much that Tony paid for Ring of Honor.
I
I
I
think
wonder, and
I think it's going. I mean, for what he has, it's probably worth it to him for that tape library because
was going to say
he
again
does
the
own the
library.
tape library, and so
And,
much of that tape library would be something Vince McMahon would like to have because of how many guys in his system came through Ring of Honor, and so there is value to that tape library, but no TV. I'm sure it's better than nothing. But when he bought Ring of Honor from Sinclair Broadcasting, it was the very end, the creative end. They were scraping the
mhm,
barrel. They were having a hard
yeah.
time putting cards together. The last Ring of Honor show I attended personally was the first one I ever went to that I was somewhat disappointed,
Mm,
partially because it was a dead crowd. There was no one there. It was not going to last. So was it a good deal? I think Ring of Honor wouldn't have existed, and most of these men and women would have fallen through the cracks and gone on to other careers and wouldn't be in wrestling today had Tony
right.
not swooped in. So, yes, I think it's a good deal. Time will tell whether it's a sustainable deal, though, because I agree without TV, I think eventually he just absorbs the talent he wants to keep, keeps that talent library, and just brands it all AEW because I don't know what the point is 2 years from now if we're still having Samoa Joe versus Wardlow, one ROH versus one AEW guy.
I agree with that, but I think Tony's play, much like Vince's play, more than anything, was that library. Oh,
Yeah.
that like, and just as a point of pride, if nothing else, there's one pay-per-view in that ROH library that absolutely has to belong to AEW, and that's All In.
Yeah.
It, you know, that was basically the birth of AEW when the Elite decided they could the Elite and Cody, which I include Cody in the Elite at that point. Those guys decided, hey, we can do this.
It,
We can.
you mentioning pay per view should also point out the fact that I still think I'm saying that they need TV to survive in the long run. However, the pay per view business, every time Ring of Honor has done a pay per view under the AEW banner,
Hmm.
they have touted it amongst the top 4 or 5
Yeah,
in Ring of Honor history. So I don't know if it's just the better distribution and connections that Tony Khan has, but when it comes to the pay per views, at least they might not have weekly television to promote it. They are soon to start that up on the Honor Club platform, but the pay per views themselves to date have performed well,
hmm,
not just with fans, but critically too. They've been good.
yes, they've been really good.
They've been really good. So
Yeah,
I think the jury might still be out, but I mean, early returns, I'd say that he's already got his money's worth. Whether it survives as its own company or not, that I think is still a big question. Is if we need two companies owned by Tony Khan trying to compete with Vince McMahon long haul, I don't know that that's going to be the
yeah.
case.
We'll see. We'll see if they're competing with Vince McMahon or some Saudi propaganda machine.
With that said, Doug, that takes us full circle, right?
Full
Takes us full
circle.
circle back to WWE and $9 billion and who gets that big prize. I think it goes without saying that everything we've mentioned on tonight's broadcast sets some sort of historical precedence for what's to come. But there's nothing that's going to be anywhere near whoever ends up with WWE as far as
Agreed.
the impact. And they get not just all the talent and all the tapes, they have TV contracts that any in entertainment would kill for. Like you have
Yeah.
TV that's going to probably get you. You have TV that's binge proof, that's cord cutting proof. You might very well see maybe not 9 billion, but I'd say you're going 5-6 billion at least.
Yeah, probably so.
And probably in the long term, whoever ends up with it, it will be probably worth it.
Even if it's just to promote your country and rehab their human rights violations.
Hopefully, that's not the next show we have to do.
I hope not.
Fans, we hope you've enjoyed as much as we have sitting here talking about we love professional wrestling today for sure, but I love talking wrestling history. I love looking back at the behind the scenes and what was really happening at times that we remember as kids when we were, just so focused on what was on our screens instead of what was going on
Yes.
in the boardrooms and dressing rooms. Now, we can sit here and talk wrestling every week and talk about the behind the scenes stuff. Back then we didn't know what was going on. This is all retrospect.
Yeah, I love getting the wrestling magazines when I was a kid, fourth and fifth grade. I remember I had a teacher who was super into wrestling just like me. You're like, look at this. You're like, yeah, that's cool. Actually, I don't think he ever said, yeah, that's cool. But I think I got in my mind, I got a, yeah, that's cool. But I'm probably going to go, yeah, go sit down, Doug. Yeah, that's Dusty Rhodes. Okay, go sit down now. But I'm curious, I'm fearful, I'm anxious, I'm excited about what happens next with a WWE sale. I don't know where it goes, and that's kind of exciting, and it's also very terrifying.
Well, if there is one thing what we can predict based on past returns, and we've noted it in many of the particular sales we've looked at, Doug, is that outside of Black Saturday, which was his first real big attempt and only to date failure, you couldn't bet against Vince McMahon's track record.
So this is true.
Will it end up in a good creative spot or good for all the talent? No. Will it end up good for Vince McMahon? History would point to probably.
Vince McMahon is going to make sure it ends up well for Vince McMahon. And again, we covered it throughout this. He is a shrewd and ruthless businessman. He is going to make sure, I'm not sure at this point if, making sure his family is set, but he's going to make sure that he is set. And
when all the odds were set against him, he picked his moment when he decided to come back. So this is not an end. It is definitely worth paying attention to these next few months because he didn't just come back because he wanted to come back.
Right.
He picked his shot.
And he called his shot. And
yeah. We will continue to follow this story because the history of professional wrestling and wrestling for sale is continuing to be written, fans, and we'll be talking about it here on the Two Bros Wrestling Show. Appreciate you tuning in on a special night where we dedicated the entire hour to a single topic. Join us, not this Sunday. We're going to be watching AEW with you guys. Pay attention to our channels, though, because we're going to be doing some shorts with some thoughts about how we felt about things. Not full shows, but we'll be giving you some content. Then we're back. We're back March 12th. So Sunday after next, we're back live 8:00 Eastern time on Facebook, and then of course on demand on our Facebook and YouTube channels. It's WrestleMania season. We're going to get right into it, talking Hall of Fame.
Let's do it. Go watch some wrestling, people.
You heard the man. Go watch some wrestling. Now, where did I put that $9 billion?
I've got some change. Hold on.